Good evening, everybody. We're now in the final session of the GamesEd Summit. And traditionally, we've asked some of the bigger thinkers out there to join us to share their perspective on what they've heard over the last couple of days and pick out some of the big themes that have come out through the summit. I mean, certainly from my perspective, I picked out sort of 4 or 5 things that I wanted to share, which I thought were very inspirational. The first is one that we touched on last year, which is around mental health and the intensity of working and how much impact that has had, not just on students and young developers, but actually right across the board. And some really interesting comments about the impact on lecturers and on senior staff. And I can say, running a museum during a pandemic, which has been open for a sum total of 6 weeks in the last 12 months, I can certainly have a lot of sympathy for that kind of pressure. The other one that struck me, and again, we sort of touched on it, but I think the real impact of this is something I'd love to talk about a bit more, which is the impact of internet and technology poverty on the diversity of intake. And I wonder if there might be a delayed reaction to some of those most disadvantaged communities that have just not been able to access technology to train themselves to make games, or have the bandwidth to join some of the virtual learning platforms, and could that see a rebound in what I think overall is a really healthy progression towards a more diverse workforce. I'm really interested, another of the things I wanted to pick up is how to reach really specific communities. And we touched on this in the last session, where we were kind of doing a bit of a post-mortem's the wrong word, I've got to stop using that, but you know what I mean, of Games Careers Week. So, you know, a kind of recap of where we got to. And certainly in some of the media that I've done around Games Careers Week, there are a couple of questions that I don't have a really good answer to, which is particularly, how do you reach into communities, such as, for instance, the South Asian community, which has a very set idea about what careers should be. There are 5 professions, and those are what you should do. And anyone from any other profession, and that it doesn't have to be just games, it could be film and TV, it could be any of the creative industries, will really struggle to make headway with a particular mindset about what children should be doing, what young people's careers should be. The other 2 final things, and these are just sort of food for thought before I throw to our panelists, is around studio culture. And how important the culture in particular studios, and how strong that culture is. And I think that was a sort of secret recipe for the success of some of those games studios that just managed that transition to remote working so effortlessly. And I think that behind the scenes, there was this studio culture of collaboration where the trust was there, as well as the technology, but the trust was there, that all of those teams could quite seamlessly move straight into remote working. And I'd love to talk about studio culture and how important that is for the future as we move into this more hybrid world, when the world slightly returns. And then the final thing, which I loved, and I guess I just have had my head down in building Games Careers Week website and this event, but I love to hear a number of studios talking about academies, running internal academies inside their studios. And that feels like a really new trend, maybe just a new meme, a word that people are using to describe how they recruit. But look, these are just some ideas that have struck me. Who would like to go first? I think I'm going to pick on Sharon, who very kindly has been attending all of our sessions over the last couple of days. Sharon, give us your reflections on GamesEd.
Well, I'm going to try very hard not to be too long-winded, because actually, having done that, it would be possible to talk for hours about some really wonderful things that I've seen. So I will try and be kind of succinct. I thought that the 2 days were fascinatingly different. My favorite things, in a very kind of basic, joyful way, is that I always love hearing from young people themselves. And I think today the sessions with the people who were making it into the industry through different pathways, I thought that it was very beautifully designed, if I may say so. I thought that they were, very articulate young people who gave lots of fascinatingly different accounts of their, objectives, the way that they'd moved into the industry. And for me, that fed into a constant fascination for me is the tension between, which is hard to talk about, between education and industry. And there is always this tension between the very specific desires of industry and the very much more general needs of educators to educate rather than to train. And what was interesting was that the young people who were talking today in particular were talking from very different perspectives about ways into the industry. For instance, there was a copywriter who'd done, had another career. There was a young woman who had been mentored into a job in the Chinese room, who had, it was called Georgia, and Georgia, had taught herself Unreal and on the advice of her mentor. And so there are, this really fascinating kind of expansion of ways into the industry almost underlines my idea about what education should be, which is that all people involved in education of any sort at higher education level need an education and not just a training. And so I think that studios often do want people from outside games courses who bring that diversity of experience, like, for instance, the young woman Emily, who was the copywriter at Marmalade, who has had a career outside the games industry, but is now bringing all of that expertise into it. And so, I'm always manic about, people learning to be articulate. They need to be able to write, they need to be able to analyze, they need to be able to be critical thinkers. And actually, if games can grow with that sort of spirit, I think that it includes everybody by definition. That's one of the great things about what we can achieve. But I think, and a very basic point, a very basic kind of observation was that, again, the design of the 2 days did incorporate really conscious attempts to be gender balanced. And as a representative of women in games, I was very, very happy to see so many women involved throughout the days, on both days, in different roles, in different ways. It was very consciously thought through, and it was really very much appreciated. And I think it presented a face of the event and games studios and education, which was really balanced, and for that was excellent. There are so many things. I thought the apprenticeships talk was fascinating. I thought that, bringing on apprenticeships post-graduation for people perhaps who don't have that very specialist training is the right way to do this, so that you could have, UX, UI, the roles which are lacking, tech artists. And there was talk with Jake Hapgood about, bringing on a level 7 qualification, a standard, writing a new standard, which could be the subject for an apprenticeship. Maybe post-graduation, that training could take place where, before people are educated, but then they get training which is very responsive. But it was a very, very, there were tiny moments of tension, but that tension has to be embraced somehow. And I think it really is important to bring it into conversation and try not to sidestep it or kind of, tread on the eggshells and avoid it, because it is there and it's really important. And I think if we can embrace it, it does actually make for a much healthier kind of discussion forum and future. So sorry, I always kind of do this, but it's just my passion is actually the young people themselves, I think, probably.
Well, I have to say, Sharon, that your appreciation of the smaller number of young voices last year that inspired us to run a whole day where we had more of those voices, and how diverse and wonderful were their different perspectives. I loved Aurora's point about never having heard the same story twice. And boy, did we get that today. So many different perspectives. So thank you. Alan, what about your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I mirror an awful lot of those. There was some very, very interesting threads. I think that answers that sort of, how do we reach out to those, less reachable groups? And I think it's one of the cornerstones of this, I like to think, is that we always wanted it to be about their voice, other people's voices, not just, our, industry voice always shining. And I like that tension. I remember that first tense day 3 years ago where heated words, and I like to see more of that. I think that's where real change starts to grow out. I love Mark's point about where with all the will in the world that we want to reach out, we want to build platforms for people to use games in so many different ways, but they're not able to. They don't have the technology. There are still barriers to accessibility. There are still barriers to diversity. There are still barriers to just inclusion, just us sharing our own voices with each other, and those need to be tackled. I love studio culture. I think one of the things that's remarkable from my last 10 years, having jumped from big games into sort of big education, is that 10 years ago the games industry was very choppy. It was very business focused. There was a lot of crunch. It wasn't a great place for work-life balance. It wasn't a place that reflected on diversity. And education was this great place. It was lifelong jobs and big budgets and great labs, and that's almost reversed now. The games industry is championing culture. It's showing the way. They're taking a they're really opening those doors and breaking a lot of eggs, to try and make the places that they work and who they work with and who they are so much more important than maybe even the work that they do. And I think that that's something that we're going to lag. I some of the stuff that I have here is we've had a tough year, all of us, but the games industry seems to be going from strength to strength, and education is behind. We haven't had the bandwidth to talk about work-life balance. We haven't been able to break down as much of those barriers. We do not try, and I don't think we're tough enough on ourselves to to really figure out how best can we design our educational spaces as lecturers and educators and educational leaders to actually foster that from a top down point of view and at an industry level. I mean, obviously we're doing great work with these things, and that's where I would like us to go. I would like us to have a real critical look at work-life balance, diversity, and just those patterns, and being able to feel happy and comfortable in our own work, so that we can build that as a platform for next generational change. And I loved Rick, you wanted to triggering change, and that's been one of the cornerstones and pillars of what we've always wanted to do. And I think we as educators are probably a little bit behind the games industry. And my fear, certainly, and what we might want to do next year is talk about that concern of, are we going to get eclipsed or outpaced by the video games industry as a leader now in educational? Do we need, I love that sort of growing interest in new ways to do training in studio is fantastic opportunity. Apprenticeships, all of those internal educational programs, all of that grassroots stuff, all of the second day of all these cool programs, all of that stuff is inspirational and aspirational. And I think we as educators should, pay a great heed to those efforts. That's my cliff notes.
Well, I mean, fantastic. Definitely things that both you and Sharon have said I want to come back to. But Aurora, give us your perspective on the summit.
Yeah. Well, I just want to highlight how incredible today's sort of young experiences of getting into the industry has been. It's just been, it's more different than when I was a student, and like stories that I've heard, like every new story is even more incredible than the last, of just sheer passion and knowledge and composure when even speaking about those. So yeah, I just wanted to say that because it was really awesome to hear those stories, and I think we should have some more, and they're great role models already. For me, I kind of want to like touch on a little bit about the struggles that Alan, you've been talking about in education, and that for facing students. Some of the things that actually surprised me in hearing, and I don't know why it surprised me, but it did, in that students seem to have lost a bit more confidence in applying for roles because of lockdowns, because of COVID. And I think that's one of the things that struck me the most. And so for us as an industry, and also for educators, how do we create safer spaces and better transitions from university to a job that, you know, raises their confidence to apply, like how there's open days and things like that. But I think it was mentioned, was it yesterday? I can't remember. Days are blended in together, such as COVID. You know, mentioning about, you know, one way to make our studios more accessible is to have those accessibility awareness in all facets in place, so that it's just expected, it's not something other. And I think that goes a long way to create those safe spaces, to make people confident. And I think one of the students actually raised it today as well, that she heard stories of some of her you know, peers not being confident enough in their own work. And so how in an industry, yes, we need to be very brutal and honest in our feedback of what is acceptable in a job in the industry when we feedback, but also, you know, pointing them to, okay, here's how you can improve and build skills, and creating that that inclusive environment to boost that confidence. So that's one of the things that struck me most, and I put a big circle around it in my notes as like the thing that I was like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And it also bled into confidence in application. So application for universities in the first place. So it's all the way down the pipeline, because they don't know what the halls are like. They don't know what they're going to really getting themselves into anymore. And it was already hard enough in non-COVID times, because it's such a big life-changing thing, both in university application and then getting a job. So that's, yeah, that was my sort of take.
Do you think there's something around just all of us being slightly knocked for six by you know, 12 months of lockdown, open up, lockdown, and how, I mean, I go back to that point about sort of mental health. I think, you know, we've all had a really rough time, and part of me is not that surprised about young people feeling very hesitant about putting themselves forward. But on the other hand, I think as an industry, if we want to open those doors, then I think your accessibility point is so important. And I think we need more of that, don't we? We need to show that there are lots of different ways that people can enter this sector, and there are lots of different channels, different mechanisms, rather than just the formal, you have to go to university and then you have to do this and then you do that. And I wonder how can we make that accessibility happen? Mark, what about your perspective on that accessibility? Because it's a point you made earlier.
Just back to a couple of points that have been made at the moment. Regarding sort of training versus education, I think that can be managed in a way that, my own personal experience, I studied architecture. And architecture is a very long course, and you have to be educated and you also have to be trained as part of this. You expect when you actually graduate to be able to at least start doing the job of an architect. And that's after 5 years. And after 5 years, we were actually told when we were graduating, you now know enough to actually start learning about architecture, about the job you're doing. So I think that if universities can actually integrate both training and learning, and most especially the idea of learning how to learn, being an autodidact, being able to constantly update your skills, because this is an industry where you cannot rest on your laurels. I think that's going to be critical for anybody who wants a long-standing career in games. You can't rely on what you know graduating being even valid after 5 years. I think that one of the things we have with the university side of our educational process is universities basically sprung from what was a monastic life in the 15th century. That's where they've come from. And in a lot of ways, they haven't actually changed very much. This has been a huge culture shock to them. I mean, you know, a lot of universities still use the monastic calendar for their terms. It has been a huge culture shock for them because they can't do things the way they used to do. And as anybody who's worked in education will see, it is really hard to change. It is very hard to change because, particularly with the older universities, they have been doing it for 300, 400, 500 years. You know, the newer ones for 150 years. In terms of accessibility, I think one of the things which we need to do for education is, now this may sound contentious as well, but I think bring back the world of polytechnics to an extent, where people don't feel that they're from an other. There were many polytechnics back in the 1980s in the UK, which were graduating people at degree level, but it wasn't a separate world. A lot of people came from backgrounds and felt this was the route that people entered engineering, entered a lot of very interesting professions, if not trades. I think, yeah, we need to remove some of the stuffiness around what some universities appear to be. And for a lot of people, they see education as being unattainable because of economic circumstances. And we say to people that, yes, you can take out a loan and pay it back when you're earning a certain amount. But if you come from a background which is less than wealthy, the thought of getting yourself into a lifetime's debt is really difficult. So for a lot of people, that's an issue. I think that one of the things that could be useful from our industry is in some way funding people through scholarships, and something which we've thought about doing. We're looking at doing this to an extent. That in terms of accessibility can help. In terms of getting computers in the hands of every young person, that's going to be really important for the whole future of this country, because the next industrial revolution is around these technologies. Internet as a right rather than as a privilege, you know, having it the same way you have water connected. It's not just something that you use for playing games, it's something that you actually need for education. How all these things are done, I think it has to be through government will. And I think government will can be actually moved around to these ideas because industry and the people who actually support them, the people who support the government, have been telling them this. The industry here is strong enough to actually make these changes and to push things through. And yeah, I think again, in terms of accessibility to industry, I think the idea of apprenticeships is phenomenal. It's a great way of doing things. It needs structure, and for a lot of companies, I think they need support and again, government-backed schemes to actually get these things in place. For apprentices, generally the best way to work is if you do have day releases and you do have qualifications and you have various other systems in place to actually help. And again, these are most used currently in the film industry where I see apprenticeships exist. In companies that are mid-sized to large, it's harder for small companies to actually bring in apprentices because of some of the other problems they have in terms of the time which they can give to people. But traditionally, apprenticeships have been incredibly valuable to these kind of 1 or 2 person operations where they can actually get somebody in and they can apprentice them and they can actually get them to do a huge amount of learning on the job. We have to find ways to do that again, because it's not that universities or training organizations or other forms of education aren't working, but I think there's a lot of people being missed and lost.
Thank you. So I want to pick up on your point about I love your point about monastic roots of universities, and also pick up on Alan's point about universities being eclipsed. How, I mean, obviously the games industry has been incredibly agile in responding to the pandemic in terms of the way that it works, but it's also been able to be agile because its income has been growing very substantially as a result of public demand. Whereas I think that's not the case as much for universities. And my sense is that a chill went through the world of universities when a whole load of young people started to get very worried about the economic reality of doing a course that they were paying the same amount when they were doing it face to face than they suddenly were doing it virtually. Let's ask Sharon. I mean, you mentioned yesterday about being possibly more institutionalized than you realized, which I thought was a lovely quote. How fast?
Rick, for bringing that up.
Oh, I'm sorry, but it was just too good. It was too good to miss. What do you think about these institutions? And let's generalize it rather than talking just about yours. How fast are they going to have to move in order to change along with the rest of the world?
I think, of course, universities have got to respond, and they've got to do right by their students. And I think that, you know, if we are talking generally, I think that the student experience is very dominant for most universities. They want students to do well, to have a great experience. There is no sort of secret agenda of, you know, we would secretly like students to suffer and pay lots of money. I think most people who work in universities ideologically, like myself, are completely against fees. I mean, I would so love to be able to tell students, yes, you can go to university, and yes, you don't have to pay for it. It is your right. So I'm very proud to stand up and say that in a public forum. I don't fear that at all. I mean, I get your point about being general, but I would just like to say that I would like to bring back next year students who I have been helping to do mini work experience projects with studios, and just have them talk about that experience, because that is a sense in which I have been able to pivot activity in my university in online. So students are doing online work experience with studios who have been, as you pointed out, Rick, very generous with their time and their effort. These are studios who are mentoring effectively. They are providing individual students with this enormously valuable experience, which then, as was pointed out in a session about mentoring and you know, university activity and collaboration with industry, is so valuable for an entire cohort, because it's not just one student who benefits. It's actually the whole cohort, and it's also staff, so everybody benefits. And I would love to be able to bring back some of those students next year to talk about how they've benefited from that direct experience of little 2-week burst. Literally 2 weeks can change a student's outlook completely. You know, it doesn't have to be a 6-month expensive internship. It can be an online experience for 2 weeks. And I have proven data, because I've been measuring, you know, those students are doing incredibly well. So I think that there are ways in which we can model pivoting onto, you know, other systems. I would love to show you that next time, because it's not expensive. It's very cheap. It means that, you know, you can spread these experiences across a year. You don't have to use masses of university. I do this myself. I don't have lots of teams, you know, I don't have lots of people working with me. It's perfectly possible for people to do small, modest projects which actually change people's lives. And I would, you know, I think it's universities can do that. They are able to allow that kind of interaction to take place freely. And, you know, and the generosity of studios means that it can happen repeatedly across different institutions. So, you know, I do think it's possible for, going back to the more general point, I do think it's possible for universities to be more open, and for studios to be more open, and for that openness to kind of collide in a happy kind of explosion of let's all work on this together. You know, and enable students to have that kind of, as Mark was saying, have that invaluable experience of, you know, the real world at the same time, you know, that this integration of training and education can take place really harmoniously.
I mean, I definitely get the sense that studios, not just the really big ones who've got sophisticated human resources functions that understand it's not just about recruitment and getting bodies in the door and out the door, that it's about well-being and it's about culture and so on. I get the sense that there are more studios that are starting to engage with educational institutions. And I don't know if Errol said this in the panel he was on 2 panels ago, But when I was speaking to him a couple of months ago, he revealed that his team had looked at every single portfolio of everybody in the year group at Bolton University. And so, and then given the kind of supportive but frank feedback that we were talking about, that Aurora you referenced earlier. And I think that's I think another example of what you're talking about, how just a short intervention by a studio, and we're not talking about a studio that's got hundreds of heads. We're talking about, I mean, I think they're 35, 40 people, although they're growing very rapidly. I mean, a very successful studio. But there's a commitment there from a small studio that can look 3-4 years down the line and say, well, we're not seeing an immediate return on our investment, but we know that we're going to need this. We know that we need quality graduates, and they hire so much more from that university than anywhere else because they've got that direct input. So Alan, I mean, going to you about universities being eclipsed. I mean, would you agree with Sharon that there are definitely those opportunities are there, or would you worry that universities, particularly the large ones, are just not going to be able to shift the supertanker and get stuck in the canal? What do you think, Alan?
I don't think they'll be allowed. I think there's a lot more will and sentiment to change than there is an ability to change. Right. And I always have. And I totally wholeheartedly agree that, you know, education fees, they shouldn't exist. I think they should get a PC and a laptop and a mobile phone for the duration of their education. Whether I think that's government will. I think as well, one of the fascinating questions that came up was how to become a lecturer. I think maybe a panel next year would be junior lecturers. I'd love to hear their voice. I'd love to see how they think the future of education is going to be in games education. To answer specifically that question, I think we would love to be as agile as the video games industry. I just think that that 400-year-old thinking is prevalent in academia. It's a millstone around the neck of what we consider a university, and I think we need to change it, or it'll be too late and we won't be able to change it. We need to re-understand or reimagine. That's an intellectual job, and academics should be doing this, is thinking about what it is to be a university in the future, in a 21st century, with technology and with these accessibility issues, with a desire to have 50% of all people that can go to university going to university. That's on us, that's on our shoulders. And I just feel we won't be allowed to change. I think there's too much, potentially fear, too much, different agendas going on in terms of where we have to focus our stuff. And that's at wider education as opposed to specifically games education. But I think the games educational industry either needs to maybe separate or start to move fast. And I think the biggest issue I'm seeing is that in the games industry, there's not a lot of alignment of the management and thinking of the whole organization is agile, whereas we're able to be agile in small parts of our workload. So we are able to reconfigure, and there was a great point, reconfigure our courses, and we've designed them that way to change, add new tools, add new skills. But that's not the same as our organization or our thinking being agile, and that's where we need to spend our time. I don't have an answer to that yet.
One of the reasons why, just picking up that point, one of the reasons why I wanted Simon Nelson to come in and give a talk is because he's been at the cutting edge of talking to the institutions in all these universities right around the country, but with a particular focus in the UK, to try and persuade them to start to adopt online. And he probably wouldn't thank me for saying this in public, but it's not always been the easiest ride, as you can imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
But I wonder if you think that what we've just experienced is, it's not Darwinian, but there is definitely an adapt or die kind of situation that universities might be worried about. And I wonder if the contraction that we've seen in some of the staff is knee-jerk and is simply cut costs rather than adapt and change.
Well, some of that is, and as I've said, I think it was really fascinating that the whole of the games industry and are reflective of the entire, mode of work. So they're highlighting tough conversations about, what it is for design. We can design our work environments, we can make those better, and we can adapt them. I can guarantee you that none of those conversations, they are the last conversations we ever have at academia, because they are logistical issues we are talking about. They're legislative issues. There are constant knee jerks to, government interaction and guidelines that change all the time. There are really, fussy, stuffy ways we do things, and that should, even we knowingly know get in our way and could change. So there needs to be that sort of ability for us. I think the reason we're seeing a sort of like a current staffing crisis is because we don't have the ability to focus on those things. Like they're not debates we're even able to have, because we're dealing with so much more crisis, and we're not able. There is that disparity between our leadership and our structural thinking and our organizational design and what we're able to do with the students. As we will always want to do the best for our students, always. That has never been an issue. It's just there's an awful lot of other stuff that we don't have in the video games industry, where if we need to realign on something and say this is bad for us, this is generally bad for us, let's just let's talk about it, let's have a tough conversation, but let's fix it. We're not allowed to fix a lot of that stuff. And I don't know. Yeah, I think there is a knee-jerk reaction. I'm a great believer in higher education. I love working at a university, for sure. I've gone to university myself, and so I think there is a role for it in society. But I think it's going to be really, really hard for them in the next 10 to 15 years to adapt to a world where, other parts of, like, even the apprenticeship program faces a lot of bureaucracy, but it still doesn't have a university to drag behind it. I think we're going to have the toughest time adapting to that, Darwinian moment that we're going through.
I don't think it's Darwinian. I think it's more like a meteorite has just hit.
Yeah, fair enough.
For a lot of universities. And I know, again, I've experienced working in universities in Australia, and a lot of their business model has been built around foreign students, and that's gone. That has gone. I don't know whether foreign students for universities here, and there are some that rely on them quite heavily, are ever going to recoup that. I'm not sure whether, there will be, after this settles down and after we get back to some variety of what normal will be, there will be some universities and major educators who are no longer with us. They will have either blended with other organizations or just disappeared. I think that one of the ways which we can try and make the education, certainly across games, better, again, I keep on going back to architectural education. I was a very bad architect. I was a lead architect, but I wasn't a great architect. But one of the things that was constant amongst architecture is that the people who were lecturing were current practitioners. So bringing more people in from the industry as visiting lecturers from particular modules, that will help. Bringing people who are lecturers and giving them time in the industry as well will help. Because again, a lot of people have come from industry, a lot of people have gone into education, and they find it difficult to remain in touch with what's going on. So I think those kind of ties can actually be rebuilt. I think you'll find a lot of professions have that kind of thing, where there is, you're practicing, practicing doctors, practicing lawyers, they all lecture at the same time. And I honestly believe, now this may be contentious again, that game development is one of the hardest things to learn, because we're building worlds here. We're building worlds with whole new physics and whole stories and mythologies. It's gigantic. It's visual, it's audio, it's cultural, it's economic, it's all of these things mixed together. And yeah, I think having people who are doing it and teaching at the same time will help, and bringing people who are teaching back into companies, as whether you want to call them externs rather than interns, but during school holidays, have them do a couple of weeks doing that. That's going to help as well.
So that requires companies to say, with close links to universities, to be saying, come in and do an internship, to lecturers who have got very, very busy schedules already. I'm seeing our academics nodding there.
Yep.
I mean, practically, how does that work?
It has worked in the past. I mean, we have done this in the States. We've done this in the States with several people, and they've taken even sabbatical to work for longer periods. So that has worked. And in terms of people from industry going to work in education, a great example of this is the Animation Academy in Viborg, where people basically take six weeks, 8 weeks that they've been working in Disney or Pixar, or they've been working for Industrial Light and Magic, and they go and they teach a module for 6, 8, 10 weeks, whatever it is. And sometimes their home company is paying them to do it, sometimes it isn't. Again, I think they can do it because they're less ruled by the strictures of, first of all, government regulation and qualifications of lecturers and the ancient history of a lot of universities. I think it's almost like a hippie commune that gets together and does these things in a very effective way, and their students benefit from it.
Rory, you've got a really big learning platform. How do you engage differently with the educators as opposed to just the students?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So we kind of, I mean, it's the same things, but in a different space. It's support mechanisms. We have Facebook groups where we connect with, well, we allow educators to connect with each other and connect with us to answer questions and provide support. And that's a great community. So it's kind of similar as building communities where we can drive those connections together and provide the support that they need, whether that's technical support or teaching support for specific subjects. And I think we've just, I'm like trying to think, like, what can I talk about? Various portals and like bringing people together. So, and that's what we do. And we also bring them in for, I mean, on my team specifically, we have a number of ex-educators that are building our learning material who have connections with who they used to educate with. So we do bring them in. And to Mark's point about externships, we've also done this in the US with some universities in Africa. They've come over from the US and spent a few weeks with us, actually working with us on learning material and on some of our projects. So that's also been really, really valuable. So there's a number of ways we work directly with educators quite a lot.
I think it's already being solved. I mean, I think your word exactly defines it. This has been part of this shift. We are a community. Gamers have always been a community. We have always been, that has brought us together. That has certainly caused some conflict in the past, but we are, we're working together. We love that commonality. I think whatever will come out of these massive changes and these tough times, it will be better for us. It will be better for the places that we work in. It will be certainly better for our students, and it will make us better educators, regardless of where those solutions come from. It will be done together.
Sharon, would you agree with that? I mean, how could your faculty be more closely aligned with industry, or are you very close already?
I do a lot of that work myself, so I am involved a lot with industry professionals. I can say that every Friday for the entire year so far, we've had a visitor from industry every week. So that has been happening, and as somebody in the chat pointed out, Charlie in the chat pointed out, there are knowledge transfer partnerships, which are, in theory, they already exist. But I always wish to do more in terms of closeness with industry. I'm constantly trying to find ways of bringing people in, and the idea of, going into industry for particularly, the point we made earlier about young academics who are coming up. Those people going into an industrial setting in order to kind of, get the experience to be, educators and to be fully aware of industry practice is the way forward for me. I think it would be an excellent kind of mix between education and industry for me. So I think it's possible. I agree. I absolutely agree with Alan that it's very difficult, and that, you know, depending on their size, universities can be the juggernaut, Rick, that you mentioned. I suppose that I am lucky in the sense that I work in a relatively small university, which and also I do sneaky things that I don't tell people about.
You've told everyone now.
Yeah.
So I do an awful lot of contact with industry that's, you know, personal, and growing, you know, relationships with companies that are to do with the trust that you build with companies, you know, big, small, it really doesn't matter. You just get to know those people, they get to know you, they trust you, and you build something that's really valuable over time. And I think that, you know, looking, you know, at younger generations, I think that young lecturers need a lot of support. They need to be financially supported by their institutions. They need to be supported in terms of pedagogy. They need to have their training, their own teacher training, you know, acknowledged and paid for, and all of those kinds of things, because arts universities in particular do tend to depend a lot on what are known as hourly paid lecturers, which I was for many years. Was not given a post, and, you know, universities can get by on those hourly paid lecturers because they don't take the responsibility of giving them a full-time contract. So I think that, you know, universities, everybody, as Alan is saying, needs to do better. We need to support young generations of students. We also need to support young generations of lecturers. We need much more of that sort of ecosystem between educators and industry to thrive. And I think it is possible. And my approach has been to realize that juggernauts are slow and difficult. And I've done things in a very, very modest way. And I think that perhaps starting these things in a modest way, rather than say, right, we're going to have an internship for 6 months for every student, that, you know, which is simply not possible. You know, I think doing things on a more modest level, which actually is very practical and real, makes a huge impact, as I was saying earlier, and is manageable for universities, and can be, you know, they can allow that. They can kind of, you know, it's knowledge exchange, it's outreach into communities. Those are things that universities must do. You know, they are duty bound to do in terms of their social, you know, responsibilities. So it is possible. It's and I think that there is a lot of will within universities and within studios, in my experience, to do this. It's simply, you know, that kind of interface which actually the BGI is providing by doing, you know, things like this event. You know, this sort of interaction is crucial for those relationships to be built.
I mean, I think there's also a commercial rationale for the educational establishment to make those grassroots sort of links, because you have higher employability of the graduates, and you're also working on your recruitment pipeline. So, I mean, I think if you put it in the right way, then I think these organizations should be able to see the rationale. Alan, we were talking in the green room just before about how, you know, put it in the right way to recruitment, and they'll be all over some of these initiatives. I think we've just got to get that message across. Now, we're nearly out of time. And so I wanted just to ask each of you to have a think. What would you like to see next year at GamesEd? And I know two of you have already given ideas, so you would be perfectly fine to say, I've already said that, Rick, but I'm going to start with Mark. What would you like to see us cover in GamesEd22? In fact, if you want to have a think, that's okay. We can go to someone else.
There's just one quick point I was going to make there, which is what Sharon's actually doing, and it goes back to the point you made about sort of the fact education is a you know, super tanker of a in terms of how difficult it is to move. But if you actually saw the meme was going around this week, all it takes is a very small piece of, you know, earth moving equipment to get that entire thing moving. So one small effort can actually break a logjam and get the whole thing moving again. I think more of those small efforts and the effect, the large effects they've had. And I think that's something which people should be aware of. You know, it just takes a little bit to get the thing moving. And when it's moving, you can take it where you want.
It's a very elegant metaphor. And I think there's also, when we asked the, I've forgotten her name, but the lady from Bolton, how she managed to institute that change. She was making lower level changes without kind of rocking the boat and actually changing the entire curriculum. But enough of those, and actually you've made really quite significant change, which is having a real impact on the quality of your course for industry as well as for those graduates. Who would like to throw an idea or two in the ring before we close about what we might do for next year? Thank you, Sharon.
Sorry, of course you can't ask that and then not. I can't not respond. I think I really think that the stories or the individual accounts of young people are so valuable. So in whatever form we can bring those back and increase their quantity would be really welcome. I think that they inspire other young people. They are very articulate. They show all kinds of specific examples. And I think that's why I was saying, you know, I'd love to bring back, you know, some of the examples of things I've been doing, just because they are so specific that they really are valuable. They're not generalities. They are just, this is my experience. And that personal experience does speak to many people across the board. Paradoxically, it's not that if you're very specific, you're not relevant. It's actually the opposite. If you're very specific, you appeal to very many more people, because precisely, Rick, the people that you want to appeal to, the people in the public who are hard to reach, if they hear that specific example of somebody who's done incredibly well and, you know, brought their transferable skills from outside the industry into the industry, then, you know, that is a recipe for opening everything and demystifying it, as which has been one of the things on the agenda, I think.
Brilliant. Who else has an idea for 22 or on your wish list?
My wish list is, I think, more of what Sharon was saying is, like, we need to be braver in academia. We certainly at higher education, I think we need to bring some of our big problems to light and have a real talk about them. I think our work-life balance is at a deficit compared to the games industry, and I think that's going to be a widening gap. And I think we need to address, if we're going to do that, I would like younger educators' voices to weigh in on that, if not lead it, and, you know, define how we're going to fix that, because that's going to be a long-term problem that we're going to solve. But there are systemic problems in that, and if we don't fix them, and we don't, the purpose of these sorts of forums is to have those conversations and get a head start and figure out where we're going to trigger that change.
Well, I would definitely like to hear about Sharon and probably Alan's Black Ops that you do without letting anybody else know.
It goes dark.
Exactly. We'll anonymize you entirely.
Yeah.
Mark or Aurora?
I think this is more of a mechanism for how you can achieve that idea, but I think I saw this in the chat as well. Definitely more roundtables and ability to talk these out, rather than forward-facing Q&A panels. I think roundtables with those younger lecturers, and also roundtables between, maybe between, and I don't know if this goes outside of the scope of the session, but maybe some of those young people who are in internships or like have just gone into the industry with those in education paths right now. So kind of looking down the funnel a little bit to bring those people together rather than forward facing. I think building those in more of a workshop panel would be really beneficial to help younger people sort of come into it.
Excellent. No, I think we'd hoped to do a little more than we actually did. So you're right to point that out. Mark?
I would like to possibly see more mentorship within the industry. I'm part of Access VFX, and we actually have mentorships available, various different forms. One of the things we found is we can't find enough people looking for mentors. We have more mentors, and we have people looking for mentors. I think it's something which we should build into our careers, because again, in a lot of careers, people have gone through, you know, education, and then they've started a job, and they'll have somebody who mentors them, sometimes for the majority of their career. And I think we should encourage this because it actually helps the mentor as much as it helps the mentee. And I think we should try and institute this and try and get this on a broader scale. It will actually make differences without a huge economic impact. And hopefully, again, building those ties at a social and community level.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we've gone over by 5 minutes and it's been a long couple of days. I want to end this third GamesEd Summit by saying a massive thank you. First to our sponsors. I want to thank all of our moderators and to our speakers. And then I want to give a shout out before I close to the people who actually made this happen behind the scenes. So thank you so much to Lisa, Stuart and Connor for knitting this all together into a seamless whole. Great couple of days. Thank you all and look forward to seeing you next year. Happy Easter, everybody.
Yeah, you
Happy
too.
Easter.
Take care, guys.
Take
Happy
care.
Easter.
You've done a great job.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.